So,
Oh, have you joined? Okay, so the
But-
one thing, just
Yeah.
checking, I'm just gonna leave
Yeah.
your computer audio, because.
did I do it wrong?
No, you're fine. Because of the, do you hear that?
Yeah.
Echo?
Okay.
So we'll just leave computer. So just mute echo and leave. Even on mute, it does still
It still
feedback
echoes.
here. Here, so that's you there.
So leave computer, okay.
And then I'll turn your video off because they can see you already in the meeting.
Yeah, I know.
So if you want to share your screen, you can just do so with that share screen
Yeah.
button, all right?
Okay,
Otherwise, this is your iPad and.
so he's giving the talks.
Oh, you're giving the
Yeah.
talks, all right.
Yeah, I was going, thank you, but.
Do you have a presentation to share?
Yes.
Awesome, okay, and you don't have to
No,
do
I
anything
don't.
today?
No, I'm just I think either Banner's doing the introductions or I will.
All right, just so as in
Yeah,
here,
yeah.
but just in here, I'll just.
Okay,
a little
okay.
bit. And all right.
Okay.
I don't know what
Yeah,
presentation.
yeah, okay.
There you are, and you
Um,
just press slideshow.
Yeah,
Now,
okay,
so just, do you have any notes to read from down the bottom here?
no, I'm using handwritten notes. yeah,
Perfect,
yeah,
okay, so
so,
what I'll do is just do this bit. Yeah, so that's a lot
Okay.
easier. So when you're ready to go, or did you want to share your screen now and so it's up
Yeah,
for people?
let's see
Well, I
it.
still don't like, usually when I've done these things, someone else's, how it'll work. You'll alternate between the PowerPoint and the video of me, or how will that work?
Yeah, so at the moment in this room,
Yeah,
there's two screens. One will show your PowerPoint and one will show your video.
yes,
And those online, they'll see it side by side. So I'll
Okay,
just show
yeah.
you how it looks
Yes.
in here.
yes,
If you just click share screen, and then once you're in there,
Do you want to
So-
put your PowerPoint up?
so
Yeah,
it
there we
looks
go.
like that.
yeah,
And then for everybody online, it looks like this.
okay,
And so
okay,
you've got your
fine.
video there
Yes.
and then your PowerPoint there.
Okay, okay, fine,
And then there's also different views that you can toggle between within Zoom.
right.
But are you happy with that view like that?
That's fine,
Awesome.
or should it be a little closer to me, maybe? I mean,
Oh, you
Can
mean
you-
your video? Would you like it closer? I can do that for you.
yeah, yes,
We don't need to see me.
Oh, you don't want to be seen?
I mean, I don't mind being seen as a gallery, but
I'll just, I will manually zoom you in.
hello, yeah.
It's eventually,
yeah, that's good.
is that good like that?
Okay. that-
Yeah, and
that
it will
was
just
fine,
autofocus
yeah,
like
yeah.
that.
Okay,
I'll just. Show you actually framed in there
Okay.
probably.
yes,
Yeah.
And then if everything does go messy, is somebody?
Yeah. You're just next door, all right?
Okay.
So
So
you're
do you
good.
feel confident?
Just make sure you're,
sure, but how, she'll turn it on, how,
oh, it's already on, so,
it's already on?
Yeah, we're already on.
everything's already live and all good to go.
Okay,
You've only got,
so the Zoom watchers are already,
so those that will join eventually will see this.
We
okay,
we had
you're already
Angela,
being broadcast, so.
the only Zoom watcher you have is Elizabeth.
Which is sitting next to you.
Yeah,
Angela looked and then left.
Elizabeth, do you know who's coming on Zoom and who's?
Well, Angela's coming. There's two people in Cambodia that are
Oh,
supposed
right,
to
so it's quite a.
come. It's unclear. There's probably people in Thailand.
All right, okay, so quite a fast.
So, but you know, they could get the time wrong because you've got to get that global time calculator.
Fair enough.
So it could be messy. They
and,
could
Alright.
pop it in and
Yeah.
out.
and is there Facebook access too or not?
No, there's no Facebook
Yeah.
access. So they were supposed to email me for the Zoom link.
Yeah,
So
okay,
the Zoom link went out to the class.
Oh, yeah, you've got some more.
Okay.
Okay. There's more chairs around. Please help
Yeah.
with that. If it gets a bit
Okay.
full, yeah.
Thank you.
All right, you're most
Yeah.
welcome. Nice to meet you as well.
Yeah. So that's Anushka.
hi,
Yeah.
nice to meet you,
Nice
you're
to
my
meet you.
Facebook friend now, so.
I was trying to explain your PhD thesis and I realized I don't really know what it's about, so feel free to explain it later when,
Yeah,
during the break or something.
I will try my best.
Look, I know it's, you do stuff online and there's spaceships. So I may have gotten that bit wrong. Did you ever print out everything? It's okay if you didn't. But I printed out some syllabi. So you can see the top. Did you ever print anything out? No. So. And then I've actually got the readings. Yeah, and I can share them.
Thank you.
So I'm just standing, trying to stand. Just try.
I did receive your email
No.
with everything on. So
Not now.
my friend,
My son says I always know.
I don't think he wanted to print it all out for me.
No, fair enough.
And I understand why.
And you don't have access to the departmental printers yet?
No, I didn't.
Okay, so here's the rules, here's the syllabus. And then a lot of people, what I found out is a lot of people can do it on their computer or. So I stopped printing things out a while ago.
Yeah.
So people just don't read paper anymore.
I'll get the syllabus from you. I'll print it out.
Okay, but feel free to take a look as you cruise to reading this. Ben said he was gonna come. Hello, Angela.
Hi, how are you?
Good, nice to see you.
Hi, Angela.
Hi, John. Sorry I couldn't make it all the way down there, but I'm here virtually.
It's
Hey.
good to see you again, anyway.
Hey,
And
you're working, you're teaching them.
Yep.
Somebody's got to do it.
Somebody's got to do it. Yeah.
Angela and I took a boat to the West May Bond together.
You see him real.
Yeah, it was great.
Yes.
You ever been to Cambodia, Gregory? No. India?
Oh, this is awesome.
So there's a stack of the readings floating around. Do you want a syllabus? Just see what's. You've got one. Okay.
I feel really bad to print all those out.
I know you don't. have to. Just look online. So shall we? 2:00? Shall we go? Should we figure that if anybody else comes, because there's 2 Cambodian people that want to come, and then 5 people that want to come. Who knows when they'll come? So let me start. Just with a brief introduction of John Marston. I've known him for a long time, since 1996, and he was my teacher at CIASI. And I don't feel like I'm a very good advertisement because he taught me Khmer at CIASI, and my Khmer is.
No,
going
a
on my
definite
brain.
success story. So,
But just let me, but so he is, and people say, where are you from? And he was born in the United States. But he's been, most of his professional life has been in Mexico. So he's actually from Mexico. So that's confusing. And then he works on Cambodia. So he spends a lot of time in Cambodia. So we have a transnational person here. So he completed a doctorate in anthropology at the University of Washington in 1997. And he's published 3 edited volumes on Cambodia and the anthropology of Southeast Asia. One with me and a couple of others on his own. And as well as numerous articles and books and scholarly journals. And a lot of his work has been published in Spanish. So he has an extensive catalog of works in Spanish published by the Colegio de Mexico. We're lucky to have him here. I snagged him up. I knew that he was going to India, and I said, why don't you detour from India to New Zealand on your way back to Cambodia? So it just sort of got that little fragment of time where he was free to come to New Zealand. And I feel very lucky. He's never been to New Zealand, and I've been introducing him to Blueskin Bay and the sites around Waitati. And I think you've enjoyed it so far.
Definitely.
And he's gonna have another week here before heading back to, a bit more than a week before heading back to Cambodia. So that's it from me. And I'll turn it over to you now.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and I feel very honored to be in this distinguished series where quite a few of very distinguished scholars of Buddhism have spoken in previous years. And my thanks so much for the invitation to come here. And so I thought I'd start out by talking about about my work and the fact that this is a course in readings in Buddhist texts, which has always made me a little bit nervous. And so what does it mean to be talking about text for someone like me? And as Elizabeth said, my training is as an anthropologist, and anthropologists may have a different idea about text than Buddhologists. And I always generally, when I meet other scholars of Buddhism, I say, well, I'm not a textual scholar. At the same time, I do use texts. And the 5 talks I'm going to give here, each of them has at least one key text. And so, on the other hand, keep in mind that as an anthropologist, we have a different idea of text. That text, we can do textual analysis on spatial relations, on performance. We can do textual analysis on discourse in a larger sense of the word. So what I work on is not canonical texts, and yet I use text. I was asking myself, are interviews count as text? Well, interviews could count as text if you analyze them as text, although mostly I do a lot of interview work, and perhaps I don't analyze my interviews as text, and yet ultimately there are questions of text even in the process of doing interviews. It'll be my talk tomorrow about a Sima text, which is the closest to what Buddhologists generally would consider a textual study. And this is, of course, the one that I'm most nervous about, and we'll see how that goes tomorrow. And my way of dealing with that will be to talk about my process of dealing with this text and how complex that could be. As I said, I'm not concerned so much with canonical text. In my work, I've been very much concerned with things that are peripheral. This may be an anthropological perspective, and it may be my personal perspective. In the article that I gave you to read for my talk today will be about a Cambodian monk, Dharmawara Mahathera, who was, however, much of his life was not in Cambodia. It was in India and later on in the United States and in Europe. And by the way, my undergraduate training was in English literature. And I'm definitely not a scholar of literature now, but I occasionally try to make little references. And at the end of the article, I say Dharmawara was not Prince Hamlet. And this is my sort of inner joke, which I don't expect many people to get. It's a reference to a poem by T.S. Eliot called The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, which says, "No, I'm not Prince Hamlet, nor was meant to be. I'm an attendant, and one that will do to swell a progress, start a scene or two." And what I know, and which I don't expect you to know, is that when I was in high school, there was a play called Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. And Rosencrantz and Guildenstern were courtiers in the play of Hamlet by Shakespeare. And they're minor characters who are sort of, but this play that came out in the 1960s, which was considered important at that time, took the play of Hamlet and shift the focus to be a play about these two minor characters, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. And so in some ways, what I like to do is to shift the focus from the main character to more peripheral characters. And so some of the people I look at, like the figure of Dharmawara Mahathera, we can say, was he central to Cambodian Buddhism, Indian Buddhism, the Buddhism of his time? And I might say, well, the more you work on them, the more central they begin to seem. But also I think that somehow if we shift our focus, that sometimes we can see the texture of the time, the texture of the whole social event and the whole historical event. And so when you think about what I'm trying to do here, that's part of what I'm trying to do. Three of the papers I'm going to give are on work on Cambodian monks, Cambodian Buddhism as it connects to India and to a much lesser degree Sri Lanka. And I began doing this at a certain point because there was a lot of interest in transnationalism and this idea among academia that instead of looking at the center, instead of looking at what was happening in Phnom Penh, what happens if you look at the periphery? And so if you begin to look at what was happening on the borders of Cambodia, or people who were crossing borders, then you might find interesting things that you might see things in a different way than if you were just focusing on the border. And so that has been an idea that's informed my work. And so I'm not, so we can say that for texts as well. So I was going to mention, this is that one of the texts that I signed, which you might have had time to read. It's a text by, I think it was really a speech. It was an article written by Norodom Sihanouk. Norodom Sihanouk was a prince. He was a king for a while. He abdicated, and then, but he remained an important political figure. He was head of state of Cambodia, and he wrote an article about Buddhist socialism in Cambodia, and which, as you'll see, I use in the talk I'm going to give today. And actually, I was in communication with one of the major historians of Cambodia, whose name is David Chandler. And Chandler wrote me and said, but really, that article, that essay by Sihanouk on Buddhist socialism is not important at all. And so, of course, this is a disagreement. But part of the argument I would make is this is a minor talk. This is a minor essay. And yet, the minor essay, if we look at it the right way, if we put it in the social context of its time, it begins to tell us things that we might not know otherwise. And that's sort of what I'm trying to do here with texts. Now, I'm I'm not hoping, my goal here is to not define Buddhist truth. As again, I'm not looking at canonical texts. People who are interested in a profounder understanding of Buddhism, well, that's probably what I won't give you. But I'm hoping that by my work, we can look at a better sense of the social context and the historical context, especially look at moments of historical change or transition and sort of see not just what was happening at the highest level, but a sense of to some extent, of the social fabric, the relation of Buddhism to society at a point of change. Okay, so my talk today is about Dharmawara Mahathera. He was a Cambodian monk. I've given presentations about him before, and sometimes I focus more on his biography, and the article which you may have read is focused specifically on a certain time period. It gives a theoretical focus on Cold War theory. And so I will be combining these two approaches. So I'll be talking a lot just about his life, which personally I found quite interesting in and of itself. But there are other questions about how this relates to the relationship of Buddhism to a certain time and place, which in the article I try to relate to the Cold War. Okay. Let's see. So anyway, so this is again a Cambodian monk, but a monk who most of his career was actually outside of Cambodia. While significant gaps and ambiguities underline much of what we know about Dharmawara, a basic narrative emerges. Dharmawara was born in the late 19th century, to a family with connections to the court and French authorities. He was in one of the first cohorts of the Cambodian School of Colonial Administration and completed exams, the intercolonial service in 1918. Belong held a variety of provincial administrative posts in the colonial bureaucracy from January 1919, from clerk to trainee judge to class 4 judge in Kampong Svai district, Kampong Thom. In the PowerPoint you see, I just was overjoyed when I found this picture in the National Archives of him, an ID of him. During this period when he worked for the colonial bureaucracy. There's various stories about him. Some people have people connected say there used to be a picture of him from this period dressed in colonial whites, and many people thought that that picture was taken in France, although actually I believe he never actually did go to France. Although it's not mentioned in the article I wrote, he had trouble from the beginning. I mean, he was a troublemaker. All the indications, his family members, the stories in his family, he was a heavy drinker, heavy gambler. One theory is that he may have been involved in other addictive substances. This is a quotation from an earlier time when he underwent disciplinary measures, when he and a group of other civil servants were discovered gambling in, I believe he was still in Kampong Thom province at that time, and the report says the existence of such morals and elements which should be the lead of the indigenous population is painful to note. Nights of drinking and gambling by officials as well as indigenous notables responsible for the collection of taxes are of such a nature as to disturb the already weak spirits of the population. I believe it is appropriate to put a brake on dangerous tendencies that have extended to such a degree. Offenders are formally ordered not to repeat this. His his work shifted, but he continued to rise in the colonial bureaucracy. Eventually achieving the post of Balat Sroke, which at the time meant assistant district governor in Banti Miakampot on March 25th. A few months later, in July, he was made district chief in Prai Chor district, Kampong Cham, and served there for a year and a half before being removed from office. He was married in 1921. I've just been told by someone who I met in India that he eloped with his wife without the permission of her parents. He had recently had a child when the crisis developed that would cause him to leave Cambodia. His work was suspended in December 23rd, 1926, when he was arrested for financial irregularities. He escaped the Kampong Cham provincial prison on February 13th, 1927. When he was tried in absentia the following July, he was found guilty of having diverted public money in the sum of 9,344.36 piastres for his personal use, as well as having asked for money from subordinate administrators in the sum of 46.80, 81, and 135.65 piastres. He was sentenced to 65 years of hard labor. By the time the trial took place, he may well have already ordained as a forest monk and gone to Laos, or from there to Siam. Well, we know very little about this. This is from the National Archives of Cambodia. You could try to interpret this, what was happening in colonial Cambodia at that time. His family believed that it was a trap, that he was actually in some ways involved in the resistance to the French, and so he was actually innocent of the charges, or there might be other ways of explaining this. But what we know is that he was in prison, and he escaped from prison, and he made the decision to become a monk at this time, which perhaps was originally just a way of lying low. And although he would eventually have a great calling as a monk, and his ordination was genuine. He was genuinely a monk. So from there, he left, apparently went to Laos, there he went to Siam, and then he went to Burma before eventually arriving in India. Again, here's some quotations. And although we have very little information about this. We have is what seemed to have been an autobiographical essay, probably written with the help of other people. It was near the end of his life, which is and he lived to be over 100 years old. And so how accurate this is, we don't know. And yet it seems to be, there may be some minor errors, and yet it seems to be generally consistent with other things we know about him, other things we know about what was happening in the time period. So just to read these, this is from a short memoir of him. He first went to Laos and then crossed over to Ubon Rajasthani, Thailand during the reigns of King Rama VI and VII, where he was ordained a second time. It was here that he was introduced to a high-ranking Buddhist monk, a living saint known as Chukun Upali Gunapamacharya, who had the mastery of Buddhism both in Gandhadura and Patipatidura, or Patyatidura and Vipassana Dura. Now, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing those wrong. He was believed to be a living arahant who was highly respected by one and all, from the man in the street to the princes and kings. Well, I've tried to talk to Thai scholars about this figure, Upali, and Upali was an important monk, and exactly how this fits into what we know about Upali, what we know about Dharmawara, is there are questions. The main thing to keep in mind is there's no claims that he was studying with Ajahn Mon, which was the most famous forest monk of this time, and yet he was doing apparently forest meditation at the time of when very important forest meditation was taking place in Thailand. This is something to discuss with scholars who know more about the Thai forest tradition. But it's significant he was there in the 1930s, and he claimed to have both training in the forest tradition. He also studied level 3 in the Pali exams at this time, which is unusual. Then, okay, yes, here it goes on. Under this guidance, he not only learned to practice meditation and concentration of mind, to live a life of solitude in the forest, but also the hard life of rigid disciplines, of asceticism deprived of all ease and comfort. He studied with his teacher in the forest, bordering the frontiers of Thailand and Cambodia, in the territories of Jamwat, Surin, and Kukan for about 6 years. As a result of Buddhist studies, he earned 3 degrees, one of which is equivalent to the Doctorate of Divinity in Christianity. That may be an exaggeration. He then went to Bangkok and Burma, where he was given ordination for the 3rd time and learned to practice meditation under the direct guidance of a living saint named Most Venerable Subhata Mahathera Mahashi Sayadaw of Rangoon. He also learned another method as taught by the Most Venerable Ledi Sayadaw, who was also respected as a saint. Now, again, there are small inconsistencies here. And yet the evidence, and part of the evidence is that he had these linguistic skills. He definitely had an impressive command of Thailand, which he used throughout the rest of his life. But we know that he was in both Siam, which was not yet called Thailand, and then went from there to Burma, perhaps for a shorter time. And he also knew Burmese, although there's less evidence of the level of his Burmese language. This to me is a fascinating thing, and I'm building my evidence on a very slim documentary evidence. But there was, in this time in the 1930s, there was a fascinating Italian-American monk named Lokanatha, now I'm let's see, wonder what I have in my notes and what I just remember. I seem to have lost my pages here. But anyway, Lokanatha was, again, one of these fascinating figures who only recently has there been work about him. He was born in Brooklyn to an Italian family. At a certain point, I think he worked as an accountant. At a certain point, he had a fascination with Buddhism. He began to go to India. He spent time in India. Later, he spent significant time in Burma. At a certain point in the 1930s, he began to organize pilgrimages, which brought monks from Sri Lanka, Siam, and Burma to India. Some of them were traveling by foot. And we don't really have a clear evidence that Dharmawara was part of these groups. But we have a small document by Dharmawara's grandson, which I reproduce here. And it seems to be a document from colonial Burma, which makes reference to that Prabhikavirav Cambodia, care of Lokanatha Siamese Buddhist Expo Camp in Thaton. And this could mean various things, either that he was with a group of Thai monks traveling with Lokanatha, or that he was already in Burma and somehow was connected with this group of Burmese monks going to India. What we know is that this is about the time that he went to India. And whether he really went with these monks or with other people, we don't know. But this was happening at the same time. And the end result was that he went to India and claims in one document to arrived in 1934. In a 1987 speech referring to his 1934 arrival in India, Dharmawara stated, Although my purpose in coming to India was to study English, Pali, Hindi, Sanskrit, and particularly the teachings of love and compassion for one and all without discrimination as preached by the Buddha, Gandhiji's non-violent methods created such an irresistible interest in my mind that I felt impelled to visit his ashrams in Ahmedabad and Wardha. In Wardha, I stayed with him for a few months. Part of the standard narrative surrounding Dharmawara is that while he was wandering around India after struggling with his own health, at a time of extreme disability when he lost his memory and the ability to walk, he suddenly discovered he had a gift for healing. He consequently began to be sought out as a healer. And here's some passages again from one of these short memoirs that were written near the end of his life. He said, "At first, I learned about healing in order to help myself. After I was cured, I learned how to heal others. Anyone can be a healer, but of course, there are some who are gifted with a special healing power, the laying on of hands. I myself have this gift. But it took me years to discover it. When I was in India, a man with a very sad face came to me and asked me to go and see his ailing wife. I'd read in a book that some people had this healing power in the hands. So I thought I might as well try since there was nothing else I could do. She had a cancer of the abdomen. And I asked her husband if I could touch her. He said, yes, by all means. I was thinking that even if she died under my hands, they couldn't blame me. Mere touch can't kill anybody. So I laid my hands on her and prayed in my mind to the Buddha to help me. The moment I put my hands on her, it had a soothing effect. She went to sleep at once. After 3 hours, the husband came. He told me that when she woke up, it was just as if she'd never been sick. She said that she did not know anything after I put my hands on her. It was like she had taken a sleeping pill. The pain also had gone. And when she woke up, she did not feel that she had anything wrong with her. You can imagine my happiness to know that I could heal like that. It was a great thing to me. So it was from that day that I came to know that I had this power. This was the beginning, how I came to heal. That's the reason I touch people. So you have this complex person that throughout his life was involved in healing practices. Later on, he'd be associated with healing with colored light and colored and water that had been exposed through colored glass to and so you have this figure who on the one hand is had some pretensions to scholarly knowledge of Pali. On the other hand, he was a healer. And we have a figure who eventually would come to associate with political figures. So we have someone who is Buddhist and yet someone who is other things as well. In his 1987 talk, he mentioned staying for several years in Lahore, in what is now Pakistan, with Deva Raj Sawhney, an Oxford-educated barrister at law who had been a justice in Jammu and Kashmir since 1928. In 1938, Sawhney introduced Dharmawara to a prominent couple, Brijlal Nehru and his wife, Rameshwari Nehru. Rameshwari was a social activist closely involved with Mahatma Gandhi and his movement. Her husband was Jawaharlal Nehru's first cousin. A few years older than Jawaharlal, Brijlal was studying at Oxford and was close to finishing his studies when Jawaharlal went to Harrow in 1905. He was still in England preparing for the colonial service exam when Jawaharlal entered Cambridge. On returning to India, Brijlal assumed high-ranking positions in the colonial government. He was, quote, this is from what Dharmawara wrote. He was, quote, a Sanskrit scholar, a yogi, and a staunch believer in natural healing. And I quote the 1987 talk, Pandit Brijlal Nehru was particularly interested in my natural healing works and I in his. Therefore, there was no difficulty for us to come together and share with one another what we have learned to make life grow richer, healthier, and wiser. They, Brijlal and Rameshwari Nehru, became my greatest benefactors in no time. In his 1987 talk, Dharmawara recounted how Rameshwari worked directly with Gandhi and discussed her advocacy for the rights of women and members of lower castes. Biographical writings about Rameshwari also discuss her activism on behalf of women and lower castes, as well as her work for refugees at the time of partition and later in her life, involvement in world peace movements. She led protests as early as the 1930s and was briefly imprisoned twice in 1942 following demonstrations. These biographical sources make no mention of Dharmawara, but the accounts are consistent with his 1987 talk and the description of Rameshwari's role in the creation of the Ashoka mission given by its current abbot. To a degree, the intellectual currents Rameshwari was engaged with naturopathy, the rights of lower caste population, world peace, were those that Dharmawara pursued from a more Buddhist perspective. And there are references, although I think I cut it out of my article for reasons of space, that that Rameshwari's husband was interested in naturopathy and yoga, which is consistent with what we know. The narrative of Dharmawara's life is told by his followers often states that his connection to the Nehru family was a result of his success in healing Jawaharlal Nehru's uncle. According to the story as told to me by Dharmawara's successor at the Ashoka mission, the person cured was Brijlal Nehru himself. The overall picture evoked is intriguing and suggests something of the social possibilities in the era. A wandering Buddhist monk taken to the household of an elite Hindu judge, convinced of his healing capacities and living there for several years, then taken up by a prominent couple. Likewise, intellectual Hindu elites of some influence, indebted to him for healing and devoted to the possibilities of naturopathic health practice. During this period, according to the 1987 talk, Dharmawara set up a health center in Gujranwala, 70 kilometers from Lahore. A friend in Gujranwala placed one of his buildings at my disposal. I use it as a health home, where all kinds of patients came to seek health and well-being. And because hundreds of them returned home cured, the number of patients increased many-fold. Like Deva Raj Sawhney, Brijlal was an official in Jammu, Kashmir, the accountant general. The Kashmir connections of these two men may relate to a plan referred to in a couple of sources to include Dharmawara in a naturopathic health center project in the hill stations of Kashmir in the post-independence period. This was to be headed by a Belarusian woman who assumed the name Indra Devi and would herself achieve renown. Dharmawara was to teach meditation. Indra Devi would claim in the 1950s that the project had been approved by Jawaharlal Nehru. The project came to nothing, perhaps due to developments in the wake of independence, including increasing unrest in Kashmir. Indra Devi went instead to the United States as a pioneer teacher of yoga. As one of his followers tells the story, Dharmawara said metaphorically that he meditated under a tree in Kashmir. And at the time of partition, the tree that gave him shelter was divided into two. We know in any case that his patrons were Hindu intellectuals and that, like many Hindus and Sikhs from all walks of life, he made the move to Delhi at some point during this chaotic time. Rameshwari and Brijlal Nehru remained in Lahore and worked with refugees for as long as they could. It was only a few months after they came to Delhi that Rameshwari came up with a plan to help Dharmawara establish a center in Merali on the outskirts of the city, the land not far from the archaeological site of Qutub Minar, just off from the main road into what is now the compound of the archaeological site. Here's just a picture of Dharmawara from 1942, and I don't know where this is taken, and I don't know. It says 1942, so I think at this time he was primarily based in Lahore, but this was when perhaps already he was, he had links to New Delhi, where he would move following the partition. According to Ashoka Mission's current abbot, the site had been used to house Muslim refugees, but was then left vacant when, following partition, the refugees moved to Pakistan. The land was thus under the administration of the Rehabilitation Ministry, and Rameshwari worked there without compensation as the head of women's issues after arriving in Delhi. No doubt Rameshwari and Brijlal conceived of it as operating along the lines of the center Dharmawara had directed in Gujranwala. Merali was still considered remote from the city and the land not particularly valuable. It was deeded to Dharmawara for a nominal fee. Called the Ashoka Mission or the Ashoka Vihara, by the 1950s, the center was probably functioning much in the way it did during the rest of the period Dharmawara was in charge. And well, note in this picture, these probably are from later period. There's a logo on the left. The point of this logo, which we might note that it was Ashoka Health Center. You know, it was always in some sense a Buddhist temple, but it also had a health purpose. And many of the people surrounding from the surrounding community came there for health purposes rather than religious purposes. Eventually it became, in the 60s, it became a hostel, a youth hostel, and international travels would stay there, including Western hippies from the hippie trail. This is also a later picture on the right from perhaps the late 60s or 1970s. There's a Western, a British man who ordained at that time, but note the flowers, note the sign that says Ashoka there. Here's some pictures which I took at the Ashoka Mission, and maybe gives you a feeling of and this is of course at the present time. There's these old, the picture on the top is most interesting to me. One of the most interesting in that the wall surrounding this area was a Mughal wall. And this is in the area of Qutub Minar, which is an important archaeological site, a tourist site from the Mughal period. And the wall is an ancient wall around it. There's a well there, which is also an ancient well dating to the Mughal period. The building, the lower building, is supposedly a Mughal building. It's hard to imagine exactly, but then it was built up as his own temple and health center at this time. The mission of eked out a modest subsistence from rent paid by villagers working part of the land and from a YMCA youth hostel established in 1952. Some distance from the Vihara proper, the Ashoka Mission was a naturopathic health center. And Dharmawara was sought after as a healer by Indians, regardless of religious affiliation. A logo from the 1950s suggests, the logo might actually be from the 1960s, that it was marketed as a yoga center. A Dharma wheel floats above a lotus flower in a bucolic scene of a lake surrounded by mountains with deer and tiger grazing peacefully on one side, and the silhouette of a figure in a yoga pose on the other. At the same time, it was a Buddhist temple and a point of reference for Buddhists. An important element of the standard narrative surrounding Dharmawara is his connection with Jawaharlal Nehru. We should be careful about drawing any conclusions. He was never such an important part of Nehru's circle that he would be, for example, mentioned in a biography. Because of the strong connection to Brijlal and Rameshwari Nehru, however, he had access to the family, the Nehru family as a whole. Dharmawara's connection to Nehru is rather different from his connection to Sihanouk, who is at this point still king of Cambodia, which is less often mentioned but better documented. The most convincing evidence of Dharmawara's connection to Nehru is that Sihanouk later seemed to use Dharmawara as a way of linking to Nehru. Among documents held by members of Dharmawara's family are brief notes from Indira Gandhi from the 1970s. For our purposes, the degree to which Dharmawara was connected to Nehru is not so important as the fact that he had links to the higher echelons of the Indian government and sufficient understanding of the currents of Indian political philosophy that he could be a sounding board for people like Sihanouk, Western diplomats in Cambodia. Dharmawara's granddaughter recalls being taken as a child to see Jawaharlal Nehru in the early 1960s, and Nehru playfully knocking together the heads of her and her brother. In the article, which some of you may have read, I developed ideas, theoretical ideas that come from this book by Henrik Kwan about the Cold War. And the point of the book, if I can summarize them briefly, is to, when we think about the Cold War period, we traditionally think in political international relations terms of countries in relationship to other countries, and this and Cambodia in this view was seen as a country which chose neutrality, and this was a rational decision at that time. And Henrik Kwan's work tries to look at the Cold War period more in terms of the human relationships and what was happening on the ground in terms of the contradictions in human terms that came out of the Cold War. If I'm not simplifying his work too much. Now, my own work, I try to develop this in relationship to Dharmawara, and which perhaps doesn't totally work because Dharmawara was not really the populace at large. He was also an elite. And yet, what I think is relevant is to see countries, not just, Cambodia, the Soviet Union, the United States, all sort of negotiating as great powers in the Cold War, but to think of this in more human terms of people sort of negotiating the way. So what I've tried to do is to show in my work how Dharmawara, who did identify as very much as a Buddhist, and yet he was also at this time playing a political role. Exactly what was his role as a Buddhist monk who was also had a political role at this time. So we can look at this period in various ways. In my article, I focus on the Cold War element. It was also a post-independence period for India and for Cambodia, for many Buddhist countries at this time. And so my point is, it was also, as in other contexts, we might write about it as the Buddha Jayanti period when there were Buddhist celebrations in many countries in 1956 and Cambodia and Thailand in 1957. And this became typical of things that were happening, and that Dharmawara and the people surrounding him were part of this ambit of things that were happening, which we can see through a lens of the Cold War, we can see through other lenses as well. And so this is part of the argument I'm trying to make when talking about him, which will come out in this next section of the paper. And some of this goes beyond before the independence period, prior to World War II. Now, let's see. The Mahabodhi Society, founded by Anagarika Dharmapala and based in Calcutta, was the most prominent organization purporting to represent international Buddhism. Following the war, there was a period in which relics of the two disciples of the Buddha, Sariputta and Moggallana, repatriated after decades in a London museum, became a major focus of the Mahabodhi Society. The society organized tours to bring the relics to different places in India and elsewhere before enshrining them in a stupa in Sanchi. And well, I've had discussions with Elizabeth recently on this, and Elizabeth has a great interest in the figure of Suzanne Carpelis, who was a French colonial bureaucrat who an academic who created played a major role in creating and building up Buddhist institutions in Cambodia in the 1920s and 30s, and then later ended up in India and was involved with different societies, the Mahabodhi Society, the World Fellowship of Buddhists, and one question is whether she may have even been involved in this whole process of having these relics returned from England, and later on the tours that these took place. The tours were wildly successful, capturing the imagination of the public more than anticipated. The relics attracted huge crowds, and ceremonies with speeches by dignitaries greeted them wherever they went, helping to raise the profile of the Mahabodhi Society, which still marks the return of the relics to India, one of its major accomplishments. The relic tours inspired religious devotion, but had a political dimension as well, in the degree to which they represented repossession of cultural traditions checked by colonialism. The last foreign tour of the Sanchi relics was to Cambodia and took place in October 5 through 14, 1952. Dharmawara was among the groups of monks accompanying the relics, thus returning to Cambodia, still under French control for the first time in 26 years. Now, Dharmawara's grandson, who's been a major informant for me, will argue that Dharmawara was the person who in India promoted the idea of taking the relics to Cambodia. Elizabeth has speculated that Suzanne Capellas, who's also in India at this time, may have also played a role in this process. Suzanne Capellas had historically had major connections with some of the most prominent Buddhist monks in Cambodia. So these are questions that one might raise. But in any case, he accompanied the relics to Cambodia. The plane was met at the airport by King Sihanouk, all his ministers of state, the patriarchs of the two Buddhist orders, and 10,000 monks, and the relics were transported in an elaborate procession to the silver pagoda on the grounds of the royal palace. They were paraded around the city the following days, and ceremonies were attended by representatives of neighboring countries. Similar to the response to the relics in other countries, crowds of people from all parts of Cambodia thronged to see them on display. Considerable donations were collected to be used for two other emblematic projects, a hospital for monks and a major relic stupa to be built near the railroad station, which I've written about elsewhere. We have no way of knowing to what extent Dharmawara had maintained his connections to Cambodia. His former wife had remarried, and his daughter, whom he had last seen as an infant, was now an adult. A photograph from this period shows him at the airport with the Mahathera patriarch, Chu Nhat. He quickly reactivated his connection to the circles of elite he would have known and associated with his youth. He probably stayed on after the rest of the delegation left, since he later made reference to having attended the groundbreaking of the hospital for monks in February 1953. Dharmawara soon connected with the young king, Norodom Sihanouk. This was a time of heady historical change, and the next 5 years, the period when Dharmawara seems to have been closest to Sihanouk, was also when Sihanouk undertook some of the tasks that would most define him historically, leading Cambodia to independence, affiliating himself with the non-aligned movement, and abdicating in order to take on a more active political role, and his vision of a popular movement giving direction to the country. But just before we leave, I don't know if I'll try to expand it, but just yesterday or the day before, there's news that these same relics, the relics of Sariputta and Magyana, will be this coming week, very shortly, will be traveling to Bangkok and for the birth celebrations of the Thai king, and which is just really fascinating, especially since I'm supposed to give this talk, and what immediately comes to mind is to ask the political implications that these relic tours had political implications. And they're never simply religious. And at this time, we have the situation of Modi, the Prime Minister of India, who from my recent trip to India, it's clear that in some ways he's promoting, for example, Buddhist studies. He would like, people from neighboring countries to study Buddhist studies in India. So he's promoting a relationship to the neighboring Buddhist countries. At the same time, the King of Thailand, in receiving these relics, would also be would also receive some legitimation by the tour of these relics to the country. And so we see this continuing role of these relics even at the present time, which is just a footnote to what we've been talking about.
So do you want to take a break at some point?
Okay, maybe this would be a good time. Okay,
Is this
okay,
fine?
okay,
Yeah,
sure.
Just get up and stretch your legs and go
Okay,
outside.
okay, good.
Yeah. But don't leave.
Refill my water glass.
Yeah.
I will have to go because I gotta get my kids, but
And then I'm just thinking, I don't think people can ask questions verbally, but can they put it in the chat? Can
They
anybody
usually
know?
manage to do that on these Zoom talks, or possibly, because when Angela appeared, we were able to talk to
We were
her.
able to talk.
And so,
Okay, so maybe we can actually, I was told I have to leave audio myself because I echo.
yeah, well, you're in the same room as me.
Yeah, But yeah, so
Yeah, Angela's there.
so
Yeah.
feel free to talk
But,
or ask
yeah.
questions or.
But is anyone else there?
Oh.
I'm just curious.
I'm not seeing the two Cambodian people that were contacting us.
No,
this morning.
that's fine, that's fine. But anyway, let's
Okay.
take a break.
Just take a break.
Good, how are you?
Good.
Like, were you managed to ask from the Chris about the editing?
I did ask him.
Just see that
so
Hailey,
he
Hailey Selassie is in here.
he'll be free by then, so
Okay.
you can.
Hailey Selassie.
July, June, maybe.
Yeah. So he'll be free. He'll be around too. He'll be
I don't
around.
originally need to go to the bathroom, but I
Yeah,
think
you might as well.
I think
Yeah,
I
yeah.
just will, just
It's
to.
good just to get
yeah,
some air, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Editing and you
So I won't go
you
to
can
that.
pay a little cash. or
Yeah, of
something
course,
like
I'll ask.
that. Yeah.
But I don't have his number or anything. You can send me.
Well, normally he is in the fifth floor.
Huh.
So the room like postgraduate.
10th floor?
No, fifth floor. So that we
Fifth
move.
floor, okay.
Yeah, we move to the fifth floor.
Oh,
So all postgraduate student
okay.
in religious studies.
All right.
So we stay there.
All right. I'll go and check that.
So are you in the sixth floor?
Yeah.
Kind of a mystery where everybody's going. Confidence still on the 10th floor.
Yeah.
Oh, where are you?
I had the choice between the fifth or the sixth floor. I went for the sixth in the end because it was next to the window and it was a bit, just seemed a bit nicer. Not that it matters that much, really.
And you just got back.
Yeah, it's 1 week now.
Okay.
So you should be fine. No jet lag.
Huh?
No jet lag.
Yeah, I had jet lag. It's over now. It's 30 hours now. It's just, it's just a long flight.
Yeah, it is.
So you just went back for a few work? Or?
Yeah, I had like some things to like fill up, like because I was like completing my draft, but I had to like go to the temples again.
Mm.
So I did that mostly. And I did other things also, of course.
Re-immerse yourself in your life in Sri Lanka.
Ben is your primary supervisor.
Yeah.
And who's co-supervising?
Farah, she's from Sri Lanka. Farsana Hanifa.
So what is your, I should wait till John gets back. So what is your thesis? Could you explain what your thesis is about? When John gets back, maybe?
Yeah.
I mean, it's quite interesting.
So he's an anthropologist, so you are doing this thing as you.
Yeah. So I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What did I do?
No, I'm just kidding. I had a question for you. I guess we're still being recorded.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, I was wondering, to do this room, we have from 2 to 5.
Yeah.
Like that. Are you recording this on it?
They told me it was recorded.
Okay.
So you're done with everything now?
I'm I might just
doing
Yeah, no,
revision.
you have-
Tomorrow's
Oh,
the,
okay.
I'm gonna try and revision.
After the
For the same.
Yeah, I've done one.
So you have the book, right?
And they give me.
Yeah.
Yeah, so my book is hidden in my book, so I was pawing through my boxes of books.
Pretty much.
Which book you doing?
To see my books, the yellow.
There's not much.
Oh, no,
So,
I'd love,
you don't have that one?
I don't know.
Revise,
got
yeah.
one somewhere.
Yeah.
But
But
it's in the
I
box.
just like to use the time that they are
Yes,
giving.
I mean,
Oh, yeah, I've got a PDF.
one of the
too, so
areas
it's-
such as a-
Got a PDF too, but I just thought it'd be really nice to have that.
I'd love to have that book, yeah.
Bring it tomorrow, but.
Yeah, so I'll come, but then the rest of the week I'm stuck with orientation stuff, so.
Yeah, oh, it's okay.
You
What are
know.
you course advising?
I'm giving presentations and doing the BA presentation and international students, and then we have our opening lectures, and
That's
so
good.
it's, yeah,
So our opening lectures this week?
this week, yeah, everything's this week.
Yeah. That's okay.
Yeah, okay, so.
Yeah, no, it's exciting to see campus,
Yeah.
to be honest. Is it going? So do you want to summarize your thesis? Since John's up, you're saying, what's she doing?
Okay. Yes, so I am working on Buddhist groups emerging in Sri Lanka,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
after the war, but during the war, they were emerging, but after the war, they were like kind of flourishing in a way.
Right.
Yeah, so it's just they're kind of different from what is expected in Buddhism in Sri
Yeah.
Lanka, because it was more about like discipline and going to the forest and truth seeking and all. But now that these groups are introducing new kind of truth seeking,
Right.
saying that meditation is like not primary. Maybe it's there, but it's not the primary thing to like understand the truth.
Yeah,
But they're
yeah.
saying that you have to comprehend Dhamma
Yeah.
to like go into those stages.
Yeah.
So it's
But by the war, you mean World War II?
sorry,
By the war, you
The
mean
Civil
World
War.
War II?
No, the Civil War.
Civil War in Sri
yeah.
Lanka. Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
It's like continuous war, so it's not.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going, when was that over?
Yeah, well, no, that is significant.
It's a really cool project.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
people have not worked on these groups,
Yeah,
so
yeah,
it's.
yeah,
really-
no, we can talk later. I visited Cambodian monks in Sri Lanka.
Yeah, I
and-
saw the pictures.
Okay, and so without really trying, found myself sucked into some of what was going on in Sri Lankan Buddhism as well. Yeah, but we can talk about that in
Yeah.
another context.
I think it's worthwhile maybe going around and just introduce, have you met all the students? Yeah.
I had met Elizabeth's students, so
Okay.
actually Warmut actually came to, I was in Cambodia and he came and gave a talk in Siem Reap while I was there, so we got to know each other. And I met the Venerable in Cambodia about several years ago too, yeah, and we just met, but I
Right.
don't know your work. Yeah, so,
Yeah, what are you working on?
I don't have a lot of work to show, to be honest with you, at the moment. I've just commenced my master's program here.
yeah. But what kind of things are you interested in?
I think, look, Hinduism will be the route I go down for my dissertation.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I find Buddhism interesting as well,
Yeah.
the Dharmic faiths.
Yeah. No, because of this work on Cambodian monks in India, then I was just there for the third time, and I'm not an expert on India at all, and yet each time I go, I have more aware of different things and not, still very superficial, but there's definitely a lot of fascinating things.
Yes.
In
And
the
then,
ancient past, the recent past, present, so, yeah, so.
and then Angela, who
Mhm.
you are up north, but you're with us by the miracle of Zoom.
That's
and
right.
You just got back from Southeast Asia too.
Yeah, I did. It was great. Yeah.
Yeah, it seemed like you, from the Facebook posts, it looked like you were having a good time. Um, and seeing a lot, so that's cool.
Yeah, definitely. The heat was something else though. Yeah.
And I was also able to meet Angela, just sort of a rushed encounter one day, but I accompanied her to visit the Angkorian temples in Siem Reap.
Yep. It
So
was really good. Yeah.
it seemed like you were gone before I even knew you were there, but
Yeah,
at least
it
we
was
got to know each
brief,
other. Yeah, yeah.
Mm.
So I'm just curious, like you're doing the MA,
Mhm.
so has it changed? Has your trip to Thailand and Cambodia changed what you're gonna do at all, or are you still thinking about that, or?
Yeah, still thinking about that. Yeah. Yeah. It was awesome to, visit all those places. But I mean, I've still don't know where to start with my thesis yet. I've got a few months to think about it, but yeah.
No, I'm not trying
Yeah.
to nag, I'm just curious, because
Yeah, no, totally. My focus really is on Buddhism. It's just I just need to narrow it down really.
yeah, and you said you've been to India. They're both in, he's already defended, you know each other? Okay, so please introduce yourself.
I'm Gap, Mohammed Malasat. So I worked on a Buddhist text, pretty much doing translation, analysis, and looking at the way people use that text in particular, the ritual life in the contemporary Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia. And I just got my oral defense last week.
Successfully.
And I'm doing revision, as much as I can. Yeah.
But, so it's possible to power through if you keep going, and Venerable,
I'm Guru Ekbadin. I'm a PhD student here. I just submitted my PhD thesis last month, and I'm waiting for the result now. And my thesis is about I translated Life of Buddha called Patama Samoti from Thai into English, and then I choose the second chapter, the Apisampoti chapter is about the Buddha's enlightenment, and I analyze the idea of the Buddha enlightenment and the author interpretation of the term Dhammachai, which he said that it means enlightenment, and I analyze what he actually mean in this Apisampoti chapter.
You also looked at the biography of
I wrote
the author.
yes, I wrote biography of the author of Patama Sammuti as well. His name is Pusateva. He is the 9th Supreme Patriarch of Thailand. He composed Patama Sammuti sermon to preach in Vesak Day, to preach to the King Rama IV in Vesak Day. It's a royal sermon. It has there are 2 versions, 4 chapter versions and 10 chapter versions. I translate 10 chapter version. It's take me many years to translate it.
But I was just thinking, when John was talking about Dharmawara and his career, I was reminded of Patriarch Sa, who was a monk and a very learned monk, but then left the Sangha and married and had children, and then actually got in trouble with the king and was a fugitive for a while. You know, so like like monks don't just, they're not static, they're human beings, they go through different changes.
No, it's-
And you keep talking about Dharmawara's grandson, which sounds weird, like a monk with a grandson, but we read that he was married and had a
Before he
was
had,
ordained, yeah.
and, well, I don't know, again, if there were Cambodians tuned in, I might. Recently in Cambodia, a monk who got his doctorate in India and a master's degree in Sri Lanka, and he was the rector of the Buddhist University, and he had the title of Samdat, and those of us who work on Cambodian Buddhism know it very well, and he left the monkhood, which is unheard of for a monk who's already has this title, and people said that the last time that had happened, that a monk who had the title of Samdat, leaving the monkhood was in the 19th century. And so there are times when these things happen, but it's notable when it does. So
And usually reflects historical stuff going on, not political stuff, historical stuff. It's not just personal.
yeah.
I think it's often very complicated. Yeah. Okay, well, shall we get?
Okay, well, to go on, then,
So I'm sorry, General,
Yeah,
I have to go
okay,
get my kids,
okay,
but I
fine.
will see you tomorrow. for this.
okay, thank you. So, anyway, so we have this situation where, in 1952, Dharmawara returns to Cambodia after, a long period of time, and he connects to a young king with Norodom Sihanouk, and, at a crucial moment, and when Sihanouk was making some of the most momentous decisions he would make. As I said, this was a time of heady historical change, and the next 5 years, the period when Dharmawara seems to have been closest to Sihanouk, was also when Sihanouk undertook some of the tasks that would most define him historically, leading Cambodia to independence, affiliating himself with a non-aligned movement, and abdicating in order to take on a more active political role in his vision of a popular movement giving direction to the country. Dharmawara allied himself with Sihanouk in the latter's drive for independence. The most obvious way to see Dharmawara's connection to Sihanouk is with respect to the young ruler's push for independence and the ways in which he turned toward India and the political philosophy of Nehru. The details of Sihanouk's maneuvering to bring about Cambodia's independence are well documented. He had already disbanded the National Assembly before the October Relic Tour, in effect dismantling the parliamentary system the French had tried to set up and moving toward taking the reins of power more into his own hands. If Dharmawara did not leave Cambodia until after February, he had also been in Cambodia when Sihanouk declared martial law and vowed to lead a campaign for national independence. But Dharmawara arrived in the company of the Sanchi relics, and is also telling that there's evidence of Sihanouk's continuing interest in relics over the next few years on a trip to India in 1955 and on the occasion of the Buddha Jayanti celebrations in 1957. Occasions when Dharmawara was present. This, in an odd way, resonates with the death by leukemia of Sihanouk's beloved daughter, Kanta Pa, on December 14th, 1952. Not long after the relic tour, at a time when Dharmawara would have been in the country. One of Sihanouk's biographers suggests that the crisis of his daughter's death may have had some bearing in Sihanouk's more intense involvement in politics. Sihanouk would carry with him a portion of his daughter's ashes when he traveled, even after he built a stupa on the grounds of the palace for the rest of the ashes in 1960. The stupa where his own ashes would be interred after his death. Taking up his campaign for independence, Sihanouk first went to Paris, where he was rebuffed by the French. Next, he went to Washington, where he felt condescended to by American officials, but he became increasingly adept at publicizing his plea. control of Cambodia was turned over in stages. The date of full independence is often regarded as 1954. During Sihanouk's self-styled royal campaign, Royal Crusade in the summer of 1953, Dharmawara was apparently asked to rally support in India for Cambodian independence. Among the documents Dharmawara kept is a July 22nd, 1953 letter from the U.S. Embassy addressed to the Free Cambodia Committee in New Delhi, suggesting he played a major role in it. A formal September 1953 letter to Dharmawara from Sihanouk and Siem Reap, once the letter had already reached an informal agreement with the French, thanks him for his help, which enabled Sihanouk and the whole nation to meet their goals. There's specific reference to Nehru. Sihanouk expresses thanks to all the Cambodians in India who are faithful and love me. A handwritten letter from Sihanouk the following month has a magazine, has a tone of great familiarity. It's harder to understand out of context, but states, I quote, "In the future, if matters of this nature really come up again, please provide an explanation of the country of India in such a way that they understand the difficult, painful situation of our country. We desire independence very much, and we've taken appropriate measures peacefully in order to achieve independence." According to an ex-monk who knew him since the 1950s, Dharmawara had organized demonstrations in front of the French embassy in New Delhi demanding Cambodian independence. He drew on members of the Cambodge community, a population in India whose members believe they are of Cambodian descent. He would surely have done this only with the approval of Indian officials to whom he was connected, perhaps Nehru himself. As it happened, India was at that time negotiating for the French colonial city of Pondicherry to be incorporated into the Indian Union. Dharmawara probably had nothing to do with Nehru's visit to Cambodia in 1954, when the Cambodian independence was still in its infancy. The story is that Nehru, arranging a trip to Vietnam, contacted the Cambodian government to request overflight clearance on his way to Vietnam. Sihanouk told him he would give clearance only if Nehru visited Cambodia as well. But Sihanouk's sense of rapport with Nehru and the attraction he had for Nehru's political philosophy may have served to bring Dharmawara, perceived as connected to India, further into his inner circle. By 1954, Dharmawara was assuming more and more the role of representative of Cambodian Buddhism in international Buddhist affairs. He published a short, cogent article about Cambodian Buddhism in the magazine Buddhist World. In it, he praised Sihanouk and the patriarch Junat and made reference to the historical role of the French scholar, colonial official Suzanne Carpelas. In January, a Burmese publication devoted to the Sixth Buddhist Council activities mentioned that he had been in Burma recently. Since it referred to him returning home to Cambodia, he seems to have stopped in Burma on his way back to Cambodia. He was then back in Rangoon in May as part of the Cambodian delegation to the opening ceremonies of the Sixth Buddhist Council, a landmark event in Theravada and international Buddhism, itself representative of the possibilities of global post-independence cultural communities. Junat, as the most senior monk in the Cambodian delegation, made his opening remarks in French before yielding the floor to Dharmawara to say something in English. Dharmawara's knowledge of English and Burmese may have made his inclusion in the delegation seem natural. Soon after returning to Cambodia from Burma, he left for Japan. A magazine photograph shows him together with a second-ranking Cambodian monk who taught, leaving on Thai Airways for Japan on June 21st. He spent 2.5 months there, brought relics to a number of temples, and attended the World Pacifist Conference. He accompanied Sihanouk on the trip to Burma again in November 1954. It was also in 1954 that Burmese Prime Minister U Nu sponsored the building of a small ordination hall at the Ashoka Mission. The year 1955 is when Dharmawara's connection to Sihanouk is most clearly documented, just as it is when Sihanouk's stance of neutrality came into clear focus. It was an important year for Sihanouk. In February, he arranged for a referendum that would be used to show overwhelming support for him among the general population. Later that month, he received a visit from the U.S. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles to negotiate military aid. He resisted the latter's calls to join the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. Then on March 2nd, in a dramatic announcement on the radio, he declared his decision to abdicate. and turn the throne over to his father, Norodom Suramarit. He felt that as a political leader rather than as the king, he would have more legitimacy in organizing and leading a popular one-party movement. He would set up a political movement that he personally had in effect a single nation political party to be called Sankom Niyom, usually translated as People's Socialist Movement. Only 2 weeks after abdicating, Sihanouk went to India for 8 days. This trip was planned before he made the decision to abdicate, but it underlies his increasing orientation to Nehru's political philosophy. Sihanouk wrote of the trip, I'll skip that. This visit to India is often described as decisive, and Sihanouk would over the years quite consistently write in glowing terms about Nehru and his influence over him. Nehru would publicly praise Sihanouk's decision to abdicate as a rather unique, quote, a rather unique and possibly unparalleled thing. I do not know if there is a similar example anywhere else. Many kings have disappeared as kings, and people have chosen their leaders in a different way. I do not know any example of a king giving up his kingship and joining with the people and functioning as the national leader of the people. That is remarkable. Well, in India, Sihanouk met with members of the Cambodian community. That is this minority group in India who claim to be of Cambodian descent. Following official business, Nehru arranged for Sihanouk to visit several Buddhist sites, including Sanchi, where relics that had toured Cambodia were now enshrined, thus making Buddhism and Sihanouk's past connection to the realms an element of the diplomatic exchange. Dharmawara no doubt accompanied him. The Times of India wrote, incense was burned and sutras were cited by Buddhist priests from Cambodia as the prince knelt down. It was at the end of this trip on March 22nd that Sihanouk visited the Mahabodhi Society offices in Calcutta together with Dharmawara. Sangharashita would recall Dharmawara being referred to there as Sihanouk's advisor. In his address, Sihanouk thanked the society for sending the relics to Cambodia. Sihanouk with Dharmawara accompanying him then went on to Burma before participating in the Asian African Conference in Bandung. Well, here I could have shown this slide earlier, and the point is that Dharmawara, this was a time when many things were happening in world Buddhism, and this important Buddhist event in which called itself a conclave parallel to conclaves that had occurred in the historical path, took place in Burma between 1954 and 1956. And here is the list of attendees at the Asia African Conference in Bandung, a very different kind of event, which is not considered Buddhist at all, but was in political historical terms one of the key events of that time. In a book in the 1955 Asian African Conference, Dharmawara is included in the list of delegates. It is probable that Sihanouk was in active dialogue with Dharmawara and brought him along for his language skills and as someone who could help him interpret what's going on. It's also possible at this point he simply found Dharmawara a source of comfort, spiritual empowerment. After Bandung, Dharmawara accompanied the Cambodian diplomatic team setting up formal relations with India. At about the same time, Sihanouk named a boulevard in Phnom Penh after Nehru. Dharmawara was at this time clearly identified as an advisor to Sihanouk. What should be emphasized is that Dharmawara's role, while very much that of a Buddhist monk, also had clear political overtones. By this time, Dharmawara had come to the attention of U.S. officials in Phnom Penh, and before long an invitation was extended to him by the U.S. Information Agency to attend a conference on education in Washington, D.C. While this was in some ways a logical extension of his activities with Sihanouk, it also represented a shift from the role he assumed in the Cambodian-Indian nexus and Cambodia's developing positive neutrality to a direct connection with one of the Cold War powers, and one with a thinly veiled agendas. Again, we see public recognition of his role as a monk while at the same time having political undercurrents. This was not an Asia Foundation sponsored trip, but because the Asia Foundation was host to Dharmawara in San Francisco, we learned a good bit about him from Asia Foundation archives. A letter to the Asia Foundation president from the Asia Foundation representative in Cambodia says of Dharmawara, quote, domestic policy notwithstanding, the Venerable is incontestably Cambodia's most interesting monk. Fluent in English, French, Thai, and several Indian languages, his 20 years outside of Cambodia have given him a perspective far wider than that possessed by any other monk and the majority of lay leaders. An almost unmonkly interest in social progress and economic growth, and he's able to judge his country severely and constructively.
Can I just break in? Does
Yeah.
anyone here know what the Asia Foundation is? Do you know? Come on, tell us.
Asia Foundation.
Yeah.
It's like it's an organization which is like funding different things. That's what.
In Sri Lanka.
Yeah, it's yeah.
Yeah,
It's really
Yeah.
my third talk will spoke specifically on the Asia Foundation, and the Asia Foundation was found in this period, and historically it had ties to the CIA. And,
Yeah, it was funded by the CIA.
yeah, it was funded by the CIA, and it had a pro-American, anti-communist agenda, but it was also involved in what we know now, which is only coming out, that it encouraged Buddhist activities partly with the idea that encouraging Buddhism would be a way of fighting against communism. And so, this will be my talk on Wednesday. And so, even the Asia Foundation is, it's a complex
fascinating
theme.
subject.
And so,
Yeah.
so Dharmawara's trip in 1955 to the United States was US,
Funded by the Asia Foundation.
no, it was primarily funded by the US State Department,
Okay.
but it had supplementary funding by the Asia Foundation. And on his way back from Washington, DC, he stopped in San Francisco, and there he was hosted by the Asia Foundation. And so some of the memos that we learned about this trip, well, the Asia Foundation has good archives, and I did a lot of archival work at the Asia Foundation archives, and that's why, and I also looked for US State Department archives, and there are many fewer of them than they are. So, but to return, the trip was from November 1955 to February 1956, and his request, the Asia Foundation paid for him to spend some time in Japan on the return leg. On August 1955, State Department telegram. And for preparation for his visit, said his Catholicity of interest admittedly involves difficulty, although a pacifical factor and political interest must not be forgotten. Stress should be laid on US educational activities, the primary and secondary education. And the only documentation I found of his days in Washington, D.C. is a confidential memorandum of his conversation on successive days with State Department officials Kenneth Young and Walter S. Robertson. Despite some token references to education, he was officially there attending a conference on education. These conversations were concerned primarily with political issues. Dharmawara showed his continuing animus against the French. Quote, he did blame the French for much of the trouble in Cambodia at the present time and in the recent past. Unquote. He made a point of mentioning that English rather than French was the language of the Bandung Conference. He seems at pains to stress that neither Cambodia nor India was likely to become communist. Quote, he is convinced that Cambodia will never go communist, for it's against all principles the Cambodian people know and in which they believe. There's never been native grown communism in Cambodia. What is existed is grown in Vietnam or in other countries. But to the general public in the United States, Dharmawara very much maintained the role of a Theravada monk, and it is the ambiguous role that most interests us. In keeping with our goal from Kwan to explore the underlying cultural links of the era, he gave talks on Buddhism in New York City and at Kent State and Stanford universities. And he traveled to several other cities as well. He visited the Berkeley Buddhist Center. I think this is a picture of him at the Berkeley Buddhist Center. And a reception with 26 guests was held for him by the Asia Foundation in San Francisco, mostly people connected with Buddhism or religious studies. I think I'll skip over some things here. He connected with an author, Robert Balser, who was had a lot of Hollywood connections, and Balser was connected with the yoga teacher Indra Devi, who had known Dharmawara in the 40s. They took them to the set of The King and I. This is a bizarre picture where Dharmawara in his robes is next to Yul Brynner, who, from my era, who know this movie, The King and I from the 1950s, he's in costume, and then he's there with Indra Devi and Balser. Balser would later travel to Cambodia, where he met Dharmawara. He ordained 2 weeks as a monk, and Balser is one of the primary sources of one of the relatively few people who wrote about Dharmawara in this period. But let's skip to the future then. There began to be, all this has showed sort of his high point, how he flourished in the mid-50s. And he was recognized by Sihanouk, the head of state in Cambodia, by Sihanouk's parents, who were the king and queen. He was recognized by the US embassy. He was flown to the United States. He had all these international connections with different international Buddhist organizations, but things began to fall apart for him. And things began to be problematic for him. It's not clear whether Dharmawara ever seriously considered abandoning his base in India when he spent considerable time in Cambodia. Although he sometimes gave that impression, as residents in India at independence, he had rights of citizenship. However, according to the ex-monks Gyalpama and Sambay, repeating Dharmawara's anecdotes, he was given a Cambodian passport after that country became independent. As the monks tell the story, Dharmawara was later confronted by Nehru over holding 2 passports. He chose to keep the Cambodian one at a period when he was being invited to represent the country at Buddhist councils and meetings of heads of state. The delicateness of this position in India is underlined by a time in the 1950s when Dharmawara opened the Ashoka Mission to Tibetan refugee monks, the beginning of another important chapter in international Buddhism. During one of his absences from India, he put an English-born Tibetan Buddhist, Frida Bedi, in charge. Bedi would later become the first Western woman to be ordained as a Tibetan nun. She was at the Ashoka Mission when the Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lama visited in December 1956. Bedi was at the Ashoka Mission following the official Indian celebrations of the Buddha Jayanti. English monk Sangharashita was part of a group of Buddhist specialists invited by India to tour Buddhist sites. He stayed at the Ashoka Mission in Delhi. While there, he realized that Bedi was making moves toward taking control of the mission. According to Sangharashita, a nephew wired Dharmawara about this, and he returned immediately to deal with the situation. The challenges to Dharmawara's position in Cambodia were more profound. Even before he traveled to the United States, there were indications of tensions between him and the Buddhist hierarchy. The August 1955 Asia Foundation letter, which praised him as Cambodia's most interesting monk, also stated, quote, although he occupies no active position in internal Buddhist affairs, He remains closely identified with Sihanouk in the present political campaign. By doing so, there are indications that his standing with other members of the hierarchy, which is predominantly inclined toward the Democratic Party, is not particularly high. This may or may not be an accurate description of the political dynamics of the monkhood, although it hints that they were more complicated in this period than is usually recognized. What is clear is that by the following year, the monastic leadership had managed to voice its indignation that Dharmawara, essentially outside of the Cambodian monastic tradition, had been invited to the United States. Why would he be invited to a White House conference on education instead of the second-ranking Buddhist monk, Pol Pot, who at the time of Dharmawara's trip was probably already positioned to head the Pali school following the Am's death? In the end, U.S. officials decided it was necessary to invite Pol Pot the following year. A letter from the Cambodian head of the Asia Foundation to the head of the foundation stated, quote, "For the benefit of the Home Office, it should be pointed out that Dharmawara is considered an outcast by traditional members of the Cambodian hierarchy and by Pol Pot in particular. For this reason, it is not recommended that allusion to be made about Dharmawara during Pol Pot's visit. It was to atone for Dharmawara's visit that the embassy has awarded a simpler grant to Pol Pot." In my interview with Khelpa Ma, let's see, here's again a slide about Robert Balser's ordination, which we won't talk about. And here we are. There's the one picture above of Dharmawara when he first came to Cambodia, pictured together with the Cambodian patriarch Chunat. Here, pictures of Chunat and Pol Pot, who were the height of the Cambodian monastic hierarchy at this time. And so we have a situation where when Dharmawara first arrived, he seemed to be welcomed by the hierarchy, but he began to be perceived as a threat. And tensions had arisen by the end of the 1950s. In my interview with Khelpa Ma, he said the Cambodian monk could finally came to assume a unified stance against Dharmawara when he called the Mahathera patriarch Chunat a communist. It is difficult to know how to interpret this. Khelpa Ma also said that Dharmawara was not in the long run particularly ideological politically. If Dharmawara made a statement like this, was no doubt only one of a number of political and personal factors coming into play in his growing tension with the monastic hierarchy. Queen Kosamak asked Dharmawara as a compromise measure to go back to India. Some of Dharmawara's family members have suggested that another factor in his fall was his friendliness with two figures, Dop Chuan and Samsuri, around this time involved in plots against Sihanouk. So this resulted in him, after 1960, he did not go back to, made one trip back to Cambodia in 1962, at which time he brought two of his grandchildren back to India to live with him in the Ashoka mission. He apparently was back in Cambodia briefly in 1969 after attending a conference in Saigon. But there was this period in the 1950s of very intense involvement with Cambodia and with Cambodian leader Norodom Sihanouk, and this ended at this time. And we have different epics in his life. He would go on to do other interesting things. Just a few slides showing that. Here he is at Nehru's funeral in 1962. This is a whole sort of different chapter, which there began to be
Of that picture.
Western hippies going to India. There was what was called the hippie trail from Europe to crossing Afghanistan, arriving in India, and for various reasons, one of the person who drove these buses to India discovered Dharmawara and his temple. And this led to some major connections which would change the life of Dharmawara. And this put him in touch with, this was, he was a Buddhist monk, and yet he connected with, with followers of Gurdjieff, which is another religious leader of the 20th century. And the person he was connected was named J.G. Bennett. And this is a whole different complex chapter in his life. And so I won't go into this. Eventually he ended up in the United States. And he had many Western followers. At the same time, he founded two important Cambodian temples in the United States, which are among the most important temples in Cambodian temples still today in the United States. Let me just read from my conclusion, and I hope I haven't gone too far off of the topics so that this conclusion is real relevant. All of this can be seen as part of the cultural and social maneuvering taking place at a moment of historical conjuncture, what Kwan would call the transition from colonial to a bipolar order. My intention is not to show politics lurking behind the surface of cultural matters, but to show the two as inextricably linked. Dharmawara's story at the interstices of this process helps shed light on the historical conjuncture. It's not difficult to compile a list of 20th century Buddhist figures whose impact was significantly shaped by their having crossed borders. Westerners such as Ananda, Mathaya, Lokanatha, Suzanne Capella's Frida Betty, and Sangharashita, and Asian figures such as Anagarika, Dharmapala, Nichidatsu Fuji, S.N. Goenka, and the Dalai Lama. Dharmawara actually knew some of these other figures, and he was in some ways a more minor figure, but he illustrates how transnational Buddhists could figure in emerging cultural and political narratives. Although we should not reduce his charisma to the fact that in various situations he could represent a link to an other of significance to his interlocutor, this was doubtless part of what was going on, assuming more far-reaching implications in times of change. A Rosencrantz, a Guildenstern character, not Prince Hamlet, he nevertheless helps to throw into relief the arc of the drama as a whole. Thus, he helps us to see that Chun Nhat and Hu Thot, so often depicted as timeless icons of Cambodian Buddhism, were to a degree still vulnerable in the 1950s and defensive in maneuvering toward their positions of prominence in the Sihanouk era. More at the heart of this article, Dharmawara helps us to see the degree which Sihanouk's neutrality, while surely motivated by Cold War geopolitical rationality, was also being negotiated with cultural and interpersonal reference. Sihanouk also sought not only a political and economic, but also cultural basis for sovereignty. The constellation of Dharmawara's connections reminds us of some of the odd juxtapositions of what occurred simultaneously in the period. How the heyday of Chun Nhat and Hu Thot was the same period in which Ambedkar converted to Buddhism and the Dalai Lama fled to India. How Buddha Jayanti celebrations occurred in the same epoch as the Bandung Conference. And the question of the degree to which there was an underlying logic to the ways post-independence national identities were crystallizing. Dharmawara's 1956 and Sihanouk's 1965 essay article on Buddhist socialism, which I've somehow not really talked about, but which are in my article, were both products of this epoch, and both perhaps illustrate how societies were groping toward a new relationship between religion and the state. Monastic bureaucracies like those of Cambodia were in fact changing in relation to independence and bureaucratic modernity. This study shows that the relationship between religion and the state is also illustrated through the ways in which individual actors, like Dharmawara, would in practice negotiate their way through things like relic tours, invitations to conferences on education, and millennial Buddhist celebrations, which had their own relation to political realities. This gives us a glimpse of what the Cold War could mean on the ground. So I think that's a point to end here. So is that my last slide?
He's holding a Tibetan
Is it a Tibetan?
silk scarf, isn't it?
I guess I don't know what it is.
Yeah. It looks like a Tibetan silk scarf. So somebody's maybe given it to him.
Perhaps this was when he met the Dalai Lama.
Yeah.
So, yes,
I've got some questions.
Yes.
So you did mention about his role on like Sihanouk,
yes.
making some decisions on Cambodia. So can you elaborate more like his role on Sihanouk in particular and what he make a decision for Cambodia or something like that? So
Well,
what influenced him to do something?
We don't have any clear evidence that he influenced any specific decision by Sihanouk. What we know is that in this period, it was the same period when Cambodia had just achieved independence. That Sihanouk happened to move in the direction of Nehru, and Nehru was associated with the non-aligned movement and had a philosophy of neutrality.
Mm.
Now, there were various reasons why Sihanouk would have chosen neutrality. But partly, these were part of the terms that he had agreed to when Cambodia achieved independence. But nevertheless, there was a group of leaders who came together at the Bandung Conference, including Nehru, Chou Enlai, Sukarno, who had developed a philosophy of neutrality. And Sihanouk, and some of these ideas came specifically from Nehru. And Sihanouk was attracted to these ideas, and he was attracted to Nehru. And so the question is, did Dharmawara play a role in facilitating Sihanouk's connection to Nehru? It seemed like that he may have, or that Sihanouk in any case identified Dharmawara with Nehru. We don't know how close Dharmawara really was to Nehru. We know he was close to Nehru's family, and yet Sihanouk was trying to move toward closer to Nehru, and he perhaps used Dharmawara to do that. In a part of the article, which I somehow didn't talk about, didn't manage to get to, which I seem to, in order, because the paper seemed to be running too long. I talk about Dharmawara wrote a little booklet was published in 1956 at the time of the Buddha Jayanti. And he has certain ideas about what Buddhism is, its relationship to peace, the importance of Ashoka and the tradition of Ashoka as a historical figure. Now,
This is in the syllabus.
and somewhat later, well, the earliest references to Sihanouk talking about Buddhist socialism actually occur in the late 50s. But in the 60s, Sihanouk gave a talk which was published in different journals affiliated with Cambodia and translated both French and English about Sihanouk's idea of Buddhist socialism.
Socialism. It's a perspective.
And what I argue in my paper is that there seems to be some conceptual parallels between what Dharmawara wrote in his pamphlet and what Sihanouk wrote. It's perhaps pushing things a little bit too much to say that there's any clear evidence that Sihanouk was influenced by Dharmawara. But the influence is either that what I imagine in my mind is there was certain conversation there, and that certain ideas that were in circulation at that time were perhaps more in circulation in the world of Indian Buddhism that Dharmawara populated, ideas about Buddhist connection with world peace, about the importance of the historical figure of Ashoka, for example, that we find in Sihanouk's thinking at this time as well. They came from, possibly to a degree, from the influence of Dharmawara, but also the fact that they represented a common intellectual atmosphere, that they represent ideas that were in circulation at that time. And so Dharmawara, whether it can really prove that he had great influence, he was a figure, he was sort of part of the ambience at that time, part of the intellectual climate at that time, which sought ways of finding a combination, a connection between political reality and religious reality. And of course, there are two other figures wrote significant work about Buddhist socialism. One of them was Unnu, the other one was Buddhadasa Bhikkhu at a later date. And so if we look at Sihanouk's work, Sihanouk it's not a major intellectual analysis of the nature of Buddhist socialism, and yet it's typical of his time and typical of certain ideas that were in circulation at the time. And in to that degree, it has interest to us.
Thank you. You could ask a question. So were there like any other like influential monks or like intellectuals at the same time as a part of the Dharmawara? So
Yeah.
in Cambodia, were there any other intellectuals or like scholars who?
Well, most of the literature that's been written about is these monks that who were they were sort of at the center of the hierarchy. And so this was the time of Junat and Hutan.
They didn't speak English though.
Oh, okay.
And they spoke
Okay.
French
And so
and Khmer.
they
and Sanskrit. Pali.
there's been a lot of literature about reform movements in Cambodian Buddhism at this time, which had some parallels and connections with reform movements that were taking place in Thailand.
Okay.
And so Junat and Hutat were very much at the forefront of these reform movements
In Thailand or in
in Cambodia. This was
In Indochina and French Indochina. You
yeah.
go Lao, South Vietnam.
Well, yeah. I mean,
Yeah. So the
so these are
Francophone.
these are the leading lights of Cambodian Buddhism at this time in the 1950s and 1960s. And of course, there were other scholar monks at the same time. Later on, if you get into the into the 70s, then there were other monks who became associated with the Khmer Republic, who were also very influential intellectual. So Dharmawara was, he was not a scholar monk. He was not exactly an intellectual monk in the same way as these people were. He did not write. The booklet I put in the readings is really a fairly minor book. Again, with the idea that it's not a major Buddhist study by any means. Although it's a hint at some of the intellectual currents at that time. And for me, it's a clue. I mean, all these different things I've learned about him. He's not someone we particularly associate with texts, really. What we know about him, we know from little things here and there, which somehow add up to. He was definitely a very charismatic figure, and that is what he continues to hold a great deal of fascination for certain people who had contact with him. And whether he'll be remembered, maybe he'll be remembered because some crazy scholars like myself will write about him, but he was not, say, an intellectual figure like Buddha Bhikkhu. And yet he created certain, if you talk about what he accomplished in his life, that some would say he didn't accomplish that much, but he founded a major temple in India. At the time, there were not so many Buddhist temples in India. He founded 2 Cambodian temples in the United States. But more than that, he's remembered as being this charismatic figure who some people felt had
Magical feeling.
he had magical powers, and yet he was he was also a teacher of meditation. And well, was he an important teacher of meditation? I don't know, but the people who remember most as a teacher of meditation were Westerners, not Cambodians, and so he was an interesting contradictory figure. But what I tried to talk about in this article is the degree to which, in this brief moment, he was connected to people of power politically. Later in his career, he became he came to the United States, he went to the United States, he had followers. He was sort of like he was like a feature at spiritual retreats. He had certain followers for whom he was the most important teacher in their lives. But he did not create a movement. He did not.
Star Wars.
Oh, I forgot.
You forgot that reference. Okay.
But I avoided talking about this, but finally I gave a talk to some students. And Elizabeth says, I have to mention this whenever I talk about Dharmawara. And his followers believed that he was a model for the figure of Yoda in Star Wars. And I was told this is someone writes about this on the internet, and I was able to find that on the internet, but I did finally find it. And so, but here's someone writing on the internet. One time I flew from Alaska to Washington DC for work. While I was traveling there, I contacted a fellow I wanted to meet with, exploring areas of his work in the nonprofit sector. When I arrived at his office, was shown, I was very surprised. There in the formal DC office were 2 large frame posters. One was of the movie Dune, the other was of the movie Star Wars. Asking about this, I found he worked on both movies. The theme of Star Wars is all about Buddhism. That's what I wanted. I wonder if the movie producers knew how close they came in so many ways. When the movie was being planned, the team was looking for a good model for Yoda, looking for a real master. Someone on the team knew of Bhante. Several were dispatched to visit Bhante after introductions. They interviewed Bhante, videotaped him, photographed him, and generally speaking, soaked up his mannerism and such. Much later on, when Star Wars finally came out, his friend took Bhante to the movie. Halfway through the movie, Bhante stood up in the theater and pointing to Yoda explained, "That's me." Sure enough, they really did it right. The expressions, the ears, the height, Bhante was short, the accent, and wouldn't you know it, Yoda is green. So, I mean, I don't think you can prove this. But followers of Dharmawara believe that he was used at least partially as a model for the figure of Yoda in Star Wars. And so again, I would love if there was proof of this. But what we can say is that it's something that Western followers of Dharmawara believed. And so it becomes part of the myth surrounding it. And so if I looked at I've seen videos of Dharmawara, I've seen the Star Wars movies. I think it does seem credible. but then I'm biased and so, but that's another interesting thing that we probably will never able to prove, and yet it's part of the whole the mythic realities surrounding Dharmawara.
So in a way, he was he was being funded by Asian Foundation and CIA and that fraction of politics, and then in a way, he was unconsciously or consciously linking socialism and Buddhism also, is it?
Well, he did not really receive much. Other Cambodian monks did receive
Okay.
funding from the Asia Foundation.
Alright.
He actually did not, although on that one trip, the Asia Foundation was based in San Francisco, hosted him. And so they were connected with him, they knew him, the officers of the Asia Foundation in Cambodia knew him. And at first were very friendly to him. Later on, there are later memos from the Asia Foundation sort of clearly wanting to distance themselves from him, because it became clear that the monastic hierarchy in Cambodia was not close to him, and they realized that it was politically not so wise to.
Connect with him.
So in general, he was a strong from his time in India, he was a strong believer in neutralism and pacifism. He had a strong connection to Sihanouk. Even after Sihanouk was deposed in a coup in 1970, he maintained connections to Sihanouk. So he tends to be associated in the public mind between Sihanouk and him. He also seemed to have some connection to people who fought against Sihanouk. So he was connected with a lot of Cambodian elites, some pro-Sihanouk, some against Sihanouk. Politically, I don't think he was clearly political at all, but he had, coming from India, he did tend to support peace movements. He was actually not completely vegetarian. He sometimes ate fish, but he supported vegetarianism. He supported peace movements, and yoga is not, of course, yoga is not a Buddhist practice in itself, but he supported yoga practices as well. So there were some things that
They're not Cambodian.
they're not Cambodian and they're not necessarily Buddhist, and yet there are things that Westerners, for example, who are interested in Buddhism would probably also tend to be interested.
So I was just looking at the front of this Arya Dhamma in India, this pamphlet.
Yes,
So that is a Thai organization.
no, and I looked for that, and I did try to do
Arya
research
Dhamma?
on that.
You ever heard of that?
Well, what's all of that?
Arya Dhamma, it's in
The person, there's a name listed there, and that person,
Kun Chong Pasut.
I did some research into that, and perhaps you know more than, he published a lot of work by
I think Arya Dhamma is not proper name. It's mean the Buddha Dhamma. Arya
Right.
mean noble.
no, that's the
teaching.
name of the organization, but there's a Thai name who
Oh.
was sponsoring this organization, and
Oh, okay.
And then Mr. Kun Chong
and
Pasut.
he's mentioned in another of the books about Thai Buddhism in this period, and he sponsored a lot of publications by Buddhadasa Bhikkhu. And so,
He had
Yeah.
Thai connections.
no, he had Dharmawara's, Dharmawara had significant Thai connections throughout his life. He went to Thailand frequently. And we know from the book by Balser, he had ready access of Thai patriarchs. So he was highly respected in Thailand. But what I would love is to know is if there might be any documentation in Thai language about his visits to Thailand, but I probably will never, unless one of you is going to come across them, I may never be able to learn about that.
We asked we went to see Chao Tiep, and then you talked to that monk, right?
Right, that was
Yeah.
the name we were trying to remember,
That wa-
Chao
oh,
Tiep, yeah.
So there was an
Oh.
older monk,
Oh,
and you went to
no,
talk to him, right?
well, no, that was another story. The
Okay,
one at
okay.
Wat Po, Chao Tiep, that's another monk. He had no connection with Dharmawara, but there was
Well, so he had the main thing is he had Thai connections that you haven't really had the opportunity to
right,
explore.
yeah.
Yeah. No, I was just thinking, you're asking about Cambodians, high-ranking intellectuals. And there's this language barrier that becomes bigger after World War II. Because before World War II, people spoke more French. And then the UN is sort of set up and English becomes more and more the language because of the military success of the Americans. And then the monks who were, and in Vietnam too, because they all spoke, so there's these amazing French intellectual monks in Vietnam that we don't know anything about because the only one we do know about is Thich Nhat Hanh, who happened to speak English and went to the United States and,
Well, I mean, yeah, eventually settled in France, but.
yeah, but he was able to preach in English, but
Yeah.
like this seems to be this linguistic split happening in World War II in particular.
Yeah, well, I mean, Vietnam is a whole different ball of wax, but
People still speak French there, educated people still speak French. Ho Chi Minh spoke French, I mean.
well, yes, and more
They don't
importantly, they
speak
speak
English.
Vietnamese, and a lot of important work in Vietnamese has not been translated, but
Don't speak English.
but there were different intellectual movements, definitely in the post-independence period of not necessarily Buddhist movements in Cambodia, but there were most of the work that has been done from this period has focused on the reform movements that were taking place at this time in Cambodia. And
That's in French.
well, some is in French, but it's written by Anne Hansen
Yeah.
and
But the
Penny
other
Edwards, yeah.
French, yeah.
But the sources are in French.
Yeah.
So this is an issue that some important sources about Cambodian Buddhism are in French, and many scholars, including myself, tend to
Study French.
put off confronting those sources because it's just more difficult.
Like if you read this article, like the Asia Foundation is going, Dharmawara is really interesting. He speaks English, he's outgoing, he's liberal. Pol Pot sits and meditates all the time and he speaks French.
Well,
And
even
hardly
Hu Tai
any,
did
yeah.
not speak French that well either.
hardly any French and
Yeah.
doesn't wanna go out.
But Pol Pot was, in the long run, had perhaps, you could argue, had much more impact in Cambodia than Dharmawara did in Cambodia. Dharmawara's impact to the extent that it existed, was not very much in Cambodia itself. And yet Dharmawara is one of his followers said, I use the word colorful, and he said colorful is the right word because he believed in meditation on colors, and he believed in color healing. So I feel like I can use the word colorful. So his fascination is as a colorful figure, and that in some ways that's superficial, that and yet he has a fascination to some people. The more you look into him, the more he continues to fascinate. And this picture, and I was in India recently, and the reason this picture is remembered is because there was an important figure in Indian history who led the resistance against the British during World War II. His name was Chandra Subhas Bose, and Bose had already died at this point. But there's many people in India today. There's a sort of cult around Bose, and there's people who believe he did not really die when you're nodding. You obviously know probably more than I do about this, well, the thing about this picture is that it was taken at Dharmawara's funeral. I mean, at Nehru's funeral, and there's Dharmawara, and the photographer took this picture, and people thought it looked like Bose, and so there was this furor saying Bose is still alive, and people sought out Dharmawara in the temple, believed he looked like Bose, and by chance I was in Kolkata. I went to a museum in honor of Bose, and I saw these pictures, and Bose also sometimes dressed up like a religious figure, and he had this charismatic aura about him, and I have to say that they did sort of look like the pictures of Dharmawara, and so Dharmawara had a kind of charisma, and somehow that came across in this picture in such a way that people associated with Bose. But what does that tell us? It doesn't mean that Dharmawara was really significant. And I try to argue that Dharmawara was he was not significant in the same way that sort of historical, political, religious figures are. You know, he didn't write a major book. He didn't, we cannot say concretely that he influenced Sihanouk in making this decision or that decision. And yet somehow I feel that by looking at him, we can learn something about that time period and about the relationship of Buddhism to politics in that time period. That's the argument I'm trying to make. So.
Anyone have anything else?
I think the whole idea of this thing of being 3 hours is.
I'm just getting the room to 3 hours.
Yes.
What we do in it doesn't matter.
Yeah. But I think this is a good length.
So, okay, so let's just have a chat about tomorrow. What's the reading for tomorrow? Sorry, guys. So I know it's a real pain to read this stuff, but have a look. Everybody know what a Sima is? Sima boundary? Well, tomorrow, it's really gonna be useful if you know what a Sima is. Okay, you know what a Sima is? Explain.
Eyes.
Can you please explain?
Sima.
Yeah. Just briefly.
like, there's a mark, I think.
The sign.
It's a sign or a mark, like pretty much like a stone to indicate the boundary, monastic boundary, in which the monks would do their activity within the Sima. There are a lot of like interpretation and the rules and stuff regarding to that. There is a rule to set up the Sima, so it's sort of compulsory to set up the boundary for monks or for monastic activity, like here in the Netherlands. So when like the monks are going to have like a ceremony, so they will set up the Sima.
So is there a Sima at the Dunedin temple?
So they set up and then they destroy.
Okay,
You
so
can set
temporary
up,
Sima,
yeah,
temporary Sima.
like,
Okay, that's
During the
interesting.
Katina,
Yeah.
the robe offering ceremony. So when they are going to have that ceremony, or when they are going to have a retreat, they will consecrate the Sima within like a particular area. And then they would follow the way to do it. I think the monk will chant or recite or something like that, and they will consecrate it, put it in the four corner, and then they will do like the ceremony within that area. So it's considered as a sacred.
And it's not for lay people.
It's the lay can enter, but in some, I think it's merged to the cultural practice too.
Yeah, that's also a cultural practice.
So in Isan, in Northeast Thai, so women
Or not
are
allowed.
not allowed to enter
The
the
Sima.
Sima, the boundary. But in central Thailand, so women are allowed to.
That's interesting.
Yeah, because in Sri Lanka, there's like temple of truth. So when you go there, there's like Sima Malakya. So women are not allowed to enter. So there's one president who like made oaths as a president in that Sima Malakya with the wife, which was so controversial.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's really.
It's a big deal. It doesn't sound important, but it's a
yeah.
big deal.
No,
Okay.
I hope some of that will come out in the discussion tomorrow. So, see, these monks in this picture, the one on the right is called Pol Pot, and he wrote a book in the 1930s about Sima, and it was a summary of Pali scriptures about Simas. And I and my research assistant translated that booklet, and it was published. And so I don't know if you need to read the translation, which is part of your reading packet, but I think it might be interesting to read the introduction that I wrote that article, and which Elizabeth contributed to as well. And so it was Elizabeth's request that I talk about this, and it's the one talk that I'm most nervous about for various reasons.
Well, Ben
But-
has an article in the book,
Oh, he does, and
doesn't he? Yeah.
I just like forgot. It's embarrassing.
I think he does.
Well, which we definitely should print out for tomorrow.
Okay, maybe he
Uh,
doesn't. Maybe I'm thinking of another book.
But what I hope tomorrow is we can get at least a better understanding of what SEMAs are. And, you know, they're what you said, but the thing is in practice, they have social and political implications. They go beyond merely the religious. And in the specific Cambodian context, then this book that was published in the 30s seems sort of neutral. It's just a text about Buddhist Sima as it's written about the Pali tradition. But if you look at the context of that booklet, you can see that it came to have certain implications. And that's, my own work is not so much about the Vinaya, about the rules of monthly behavior, although that's very interesting and important in itself. And some of you can, I'm sure, can tell me things about that I don't know. But as it relates to my work, it's interesting because it tells about certain developments in Cambodian Buddhism in a certain period of time. And so that's what I hope you might get out of the talk tomorrow. And so I want to say it'll be shorter tomorrow, but I can't promise anything. So
Sorry, he didn't write in that. Satoru did. Satoru has a chapter.
okay, yeah,
Kobayashi has a chapter.
yeah.
Sorry, Ben's got another chapter.
It has a lot of chapters in a lot of places.
Sorry.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
But the new Buddhist groups I'm like studying, they don't have Sima at all, I think. They
Okay.
just don't. It's
And
just-
that's quite interesting too.
It's really
Quite
interesting.
Too.
So
Yeah.
do they have like the boundary? Do they set up the boundary for?
Not really, because they are not into like rituals per se or disciplinary like Vinaya Pitaka, they are not into Vinaya Pitaka. So they're saying like Abhidhamma and like simple preaching and how to attract more young people. So they are blurring the boundary between lay and the monastic communities.
Mess with that boring stuff. Just get to the real stuff.
Stuff.
Yeah. That makes sense, But then, if you start looking at the Pali Canon, it's like, whoa,
There's a huge,
big.
big problems on Sima Katha. So versus like Mahanikaya, the traditional one,
They can't
the
join
reform
together.
one, they fight on like the Sima. They have different interpretation of the Sima Katha.
Yeah.
And they can't perform Sangha rituals together.
The splits of the
So
the
splits.
sects,
The Nikaya,
the Nikaya.
you have to be ordained in the same system, same lineage. Yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah, but because these groups don't have ordination, most of
Mhm.
them have not ordained. So that's also interesting.
So that
So
means they don't get.
lay movement. This is pretty much.
It's not lay movement, they're robe monks, but
Oh.
still they have like lay preachers also, some of the groups. So that's like one monk, he's not able to like make others ordained because he's not an ordained monk. But there are a lot of lay preachers who's like in the ground operating individually, independently, but at the same time connected to the group.
Mhm.
And
So they have their own lineage within their movement.
yeah,
So they're almost like starting in the Nikaya.
yeah, that's what, but it's not with this, I don't know, rituals and traditions, so.
And, and yeah, the same, well, it's different, but within Cambodia as well, there are movements within Cambodian Buddhism that seem like they're moving in the direction of creating a new Nikaya. But then, of course, the authorities do not want the creation of a new Nikaya. And, so
The last thing they want is a new Nikaya. Yeah. Was it Gehari's thesis? Like, depending on which you were ordained with, you could get an allowance from the government. And if you didn't have the right ordination, then you didn't get the ID card and you couldn't get on the pension list, or it was like a big deal. Yeah. So it's not just theoretical, it's about how you manage to survive as a religious person. Hmm. Yeah, so Sima.
Sima will be fun.
Anyway, I want you all to come prepared and give me input tomorrow. I'm not not saying you need, well, of course, if you could read it, it's good, but I think you all know about simas in your own traditions. And I do welcome your input in my fairly superficial understanding of simas myself.
I think also like Hinduism also have something similar. I think.
I'm not sure, not for, so I've done the reading. And I didn't recognize a lot. Yeah, there didn't seem to be anything that, very few things came up and I was like, oh, that links to Hinduism. So I don't have a full answer for you, but nothing sort of, not a lot came up that I was familiar with.
We used to read is it Mircea Eliade when we did religious studies in the Dark Ages, and he was all about sacred space, the idea of sacred space, profane space. So there's an element of that in any religion, like Aboriginal, Maori, Tapu, Noah. But it seems like the Nikaya is the Vinaya, not the Nikaya. The Vinaya is absolutely neurotic about it. Like they just take it to an extreme level of anxiety. The Vinaya, which is Ben's thing is Buddhist law, so that's why I was thinking he's written other stuff about Sri Lankan legal systems. Yeah.
Okay, well, are we still being recorded?
Yeah, I don't know how to stop it. That's what she was showing me on here. It says leave.
Leave.
Should we leave?
Okay, let's leave.
Okay.